The shocking news that Russia has officially stepped into the conflict, moving to destroy Israel without hesitation or mercy, is not merely a headline, it is history in motion. The question before us is not only what is happening, but why now and what this means for the world order. When a nation like Russia, armed with both the world's largest nuclear arsenal and the weight of decades of strategic ambition, declares direct involvement, we must pause and ask ourselves, is this the point at which global politics breaks away from diplomacy and enters an age of raw confrontation? Think carefully. Israel, often portrayed as an untouchable fortress supported by Western powers, is suddenly vulnerable in a way that few imagined possible. And Russia, calculating with precision, is exploiting those vulnerabilities in a manner that demonstrates not just military power, but political audacity. What makes this moment truly alarming is not only Russia's firepower, but the symbolism. For decades, the Middle East has been a chessboard for empires, America, Britain, NATO, Iran, and now Russia. But Russia's declaration of destroying Israel without mercy is a bold rejection of the so-called international order that has propped up Israel's dominance in the region. This is not just a military act. It is a statement to Washington, to Brussels, and to every capital city that Russia no longer plays by the rules of the West. It is telling the world we set our own rules now. Here is where the real hook lies. If Russia succeeds in crippling Israel, what comes next? Will the United States intervene at the risk of igniting World War II? Will Europe, fractured and divided, have the will to engage? Or will this mark the dawn of a new reality where smaller nations look to Moscow, not Washington, for protection and partnership? These are not hypotheticals. They are urgent questions shaping the very fabric of our global economy, our security, and the future of international law itself. I want you to think about the economic undercurrents. Every missile, every declaration of war, every political move reverberates through oil prices, trade routes, financial markets, and currency stability. What we are watching in Israel is not isolated. It will affect your grocery bills, your fuel costs, your job security. Wars are never only about soldiers on the battlefield. They are about the redistribution of resources and the reshaping of power. Russia understands this very well, and by openly moving against Israel, it is sending a chilling warning. The old world order is collapsing before our very eyes. Let us be clear, this is not a moral endorsement of violence, nor is it an argument in favor of war. It is instead an acknowledgement of reality. Nations act in their own interest. And right now, Russia sees an opening to weaken the Western grip on the Middle East. This is geopolitics at its rawest, stripped of the illusions of peace talks and international cooperation, and the world must wake up to this before it is too late. Russia's direct involvement in the conflict against Israel has opened a historic chapter in global politics, one that is both deeply alarming and profoundly transformative. For decades, Russia positioned itself as a power broker in the Middle East, often leveraging its alliances with Iran, Syria, and other regional players to strengthen its influence without stepping too far into the front lines. But now, by officially declaring its role in moving against Israel, Moscow has shattered the facade of careful diplomacy and entered into a new, aggressive phase of geopolitical confrontation. The world must not underestimate what this means. This is not simply a military maneuver. It is a statement of intent, one that shakes the very foundations of how international power has been distributed since the end of World War II. Russia is no longer hiding behind proxies or subtle interventions. It is now openly placing itself at the center of one of the most volatile conflicts on Earth. To understand the weight of this development, one must consider history. Russia has always sought to balance its ambitions with its constraints. From the Soviet Union's Cold War strategy of supporting Arab states against Israel, to Putin's more cautious approach of negotiating ties with both Israel and its rivals, Moscow has historically played the long game. But this moment feels different. Russia is no longer interested in balance. It is making a bold declaration that it will confront Israel head on. Why? Because the stakes are higher than ever before. Russia understands that the West is weakened by internal divisions, America is struggling with economic and political fractures, and Europe is distracted by its own crisis. In this window of vulnerability, Moscow sees the perfect opportunity to challenge the Western-led order in the most symbolic way possible by targeting one of Washington's closest and most vital allies. Here lies the first hook. If Russia can weaken Israel, it does not just hurt one nation. It undermines the entire credibility of American power projection in the Middle East. Think of the domino effect. Allies such as Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Jordan, and Egypt are watching closely. If Israel, with its advanced defenses and decades of U.S. support, can be directly confronted by Russia, then what confidence do these other nations have that Washington can protect them in their hour of need? The Middle East could witness a seismic shift in alliances, with countries pivoting toward Moscow or Beijing rather than continuing to rely on Washington. This is precisely what Russia wants, and its actions today are designed to achieve that long-term realignment. Another hook emerges when we consider the psychology of power. For years, Israel has been portrayed as invincible, a regional superpower with unmatched military technology, including the Iron Dome and advanced intelligence networks. But Russia's involvement threatens to puncture that myth. If Moscow can expose vulnerabilities in Israel's defense systems, if it can prove that Israeli military might is not unbreakable, then it not only changes the battlefield, it changes perceptions. Perceptions of strength are just as important as strength itself, and Russia understands this well. Wars are not only fought with missiles and tanks, but also with narratives, with the ability to shape how the world views power. Russia's involvement is meant to rewrite that narrative, that Israel is no longer untouchable, and that Russia can bend the arc of Middle Eastern politics at will. But let us also reflect on what this means for Russia itself. This is not a risk-free move. By directly entering the conflict, Moscow is placing itself in the crosshairs of US and NATO responses. Yet, this may be precisely the gamble Putin is willing to take. Russia thrives on projecting defiance in the face of Western pressure. The Ukraine war has already hardened Russia's resolve, and sanctions have only deepened its pivot toward the East. Now, by stepping into the Israeli conflict, Russia signals that it is not afraid of isolation. It is ready to build an alternative world order, one defined not by Washington, but by Moscow and its allies. This is an audacious gamble, but it is also one that resonates with many nations tired of Western dominance. Consider this final hook. What if Russia's direct involvement sparks a broader realignment, not just in the Middle East, but across the global South? Nations in Africa, Latin America, and Asia are watching carefully. Many have long resented what they see as Western hypocrisy, where human rights are invoked selectively and interventions are justified only when they serve Western interests. Russia's defiance, its willingness to act decisively against a symbol of Western-backed power, may inspire these nations to re-evaluate their alignments. Suddenly, Moscow does not just appear as a military force, but as a political alternative, a nation willing to do what others only dare to whisper. The truth is, Russia's official entry into this conflict is not just about Israel. It is about shaking the architecture of global power itself. This is a bold step into dangerous waters, one that carries risks for Russia, for Israel, and for the entire world. But the very fact that Moscow has chosen to act now, without hesitation and without mercy, should force to confront an uncomfortable reality. The old rules no longer apply. A new game has begun, and Russia has just made its opening move. Israel's strategic vulnerability has been exposed in a way that few could have imagined, and the implications of this exposure stretch far beyond the borders of the Middle East. For decades, Israel has been regarded as one of the most heavily fortified nations in the world, a state with unmatched technological capabilities, highly trained defense forces, and an unshakable alliance with the United States. Yet, what we are now witnessing is the crumbling of that perception as Russian involvement directly targets the very foundation of Israel's supposed invincibility. This vulnerability is not merely military, it is political, psychological, and economic, making it one of the most pivotal turning points in modern geopolitics. To fully grasp the magnitude of this vulnerability, we must understand the myth that has surrounded Israel for generations. Since the Six-Day War of 1967, Israel has carried the image of an unbeatable power, small in geography, but mighty in strength, capable of defeating multiple adversaries at once. The Iron Dome defense system, frequently celebrated in global media, was seen as the impenetrable shield protecting Israel from rocket fire. But history reminds us that no shield is permanent, no fortress is beyond reach. Russia, with its advanced missile systems, cyber capabilities, and strategic experience, now tests the limits of Israel's security in ways that smaller adversaries never could. If Russia demonstrates that the Iron Dome or other defense layers can be overwhelmed, the entire narrative of Israel's superiority collapses overnight. Here is the first hook. Once the illusion of invulnerability is shattered, fear begins to replace confidence. Israel's enemies, long held in check by the perception of Israeli dominance, will feel emboldened. Iran, Hezbollah, and even smaller militant groups may see Russia's direct challenge as proof that Israel's defense systems are not infallible. A new wave of confrontation could emerge, not simply because Russia acts militarily, but because the psychological barrier that once protected Israel has been broken. Fear, once a tool that Israel wielded over its adversaries, could now begin to work in reverse. But the story does not end with military exposure. Israel's political standing is tied directly to its ability to project power and resilience. Washington has invested billions of dollars in military aid, intelligence sharing, and diplomatic protection at the United Nations, precisely because Israel was seen as an indispensable ally in a turbulent region. If Israel begins to falter, if it appears unable to withstand Russian pressure, then even its strongest allies will face questions. How sustainable is this relationship? How long can Washington afford to defend a state whose vulnerabilities are becoming increasingly visible to the world? This political doubt could erode the very foundations of Israel's alliances, weakening its voice on the international stage and forcing it into a more defensive posture. Another powerful hook lies in the economic consequences of vulnerability. Wars are expensive, but the perception of vulnerability is even more costly. Investors, global corporations, and financial markets are sensitive to instability. If Israel, once seen as a hub of technological innovation and stability in the Middle East, is suddenly painted as a nation at risk of collapse, then capital flight, economic slowdown, and reduced foreign investments are inevitable. Russia understands this dynamic well. Its goal is not only to challenge Israel militarily, but to strike at its confidence and credibility in every domain. By targeting Israel's sense of security, Moscow indirectly undermines the country's economy and its role as a regional hub of power. The question we must ask is this: how long can Israel rely on its Western backers to cover these vulnerabilities? Russia is not Hamas, nor Hezbollah, nor any of the groups Israel has fought before. It is a global superpower with resources, alliances, and experience that far exceed anything Israel has confronted in its modern history. If Israel is struggling against smaller adversaries, how will it withstand a nation that has not only declared war, but has the willingness to act without restraint? This is the terrifying reality of strategic vulnerability. It is not just about present weakness, but about the erosion of future strength. And finally, let us not underestimate the power of perception in global politics. The moment Israel appears vulnerable, other nations begin to question their own alignments. Saudi Arabia, once considering normalization with Israel, may suddenly hesitate, doubting the wisdom of linking itself to a state that appears weaker than advertised. Nations in Africa, Asia, and beyond who once viewed Israel as a symbol of strength may shift their calculations toward Russia or China, seeing them as more reliable partners in the emerging world order. Vulnerability, therefore, is contagious. It spreads beyond borders, reshaping alliances, redrawing political maps, and shifting the balance of power. Israel's vulnerability is not just a passing weakness, it is the unraveling of a narrative that has sustained its dominance for decades. Russia's ability to expose this weakness is not just a tactical victory, but a strategic one, capable of altering the course of global politics. The world must now reckon with a sobering truth. The state, once seen as unshakable, may no longer be so, and the consequences of that shift will echo across every corner of the globe. Russia's decision to confront Israel directly is not simply an attack on a single nation, it is a calculated challenge to U.S. dominance in the Middle East and, by extension, the global order. For decades, the United States has maintained its hegemony in the region through an intricate web of military bases, arms deals, intelligence cooperation, and most importantly, its unwavering support for Israel. Washington's credibility as the ultimate guarantor of stability has been built on the perception that no adversary could threaten Israel without facing swift and decisive consequences from the United States. Now, Russia is testing that assumption, forcing Washington into a position it has not been in for generations. On the defensive, scrambling to protect its reputation as the world's leading power. The real hook here is that Russia is not merely attacking Israel, it is attacking the very foundation of American prestige. The United States has used Israel as both a symbol and a tool of its influence. Israel was proof that American support could create a fortress of democracy and strength in a hostile region. If Russia succeeds in breaking that fortress, what does it say about U.S. power? The answer is sobering. It reveals that American promises of protection are no longer ironclad. Allies across the globe, whether in Asia, Europe, or Africa, will look at Israel's predicament and wonder if Washington can truly defend them when pressure comes. In this way, Russia's actions ripple outward, shaking the credibility of the U.S. far beyond the Middle East. Consider the bind Washington faces. If the United States intervenes directly to protect Israel, it risks open confrontation with Russia, a nuclear power, at a moment when it is already stretched thin by its commitments in Ukraine, the Pacific, and NATO. Yet if Washington hesitates, if it fails to act with force and clarity, it sends an equally damaging message that the U.S. is unwilling or unable to stand by its allies when the stakes are highest. Either path carries immense risk. This is precisely the trap Russia wants to set, knowing that American power is not only measured by its weapons, but by the belief in its reliability. Once that belief falters, the entire architecture of U.S. dominance begins to collapse. Another powerful hook lies in how this challenge exposes the fragility of America's global strategy. For years, Washington has relied on deterrence, the idea that its power is so overwhelming that no nation would dare challenge it directly. But deterrence only works until someone calls the bluff. Russia's bold move against Israel is that call. It is Moscow's way of saying to the world, the U.S. cannot stop us. And if the U.S. fails to respond effectively, that perception could embolden other powers. China may accelerate its plans toward Taiwan. North Korea may intensify provocations, and even smaller nations may start resisting Washington's influence more openly. What begins in the Middle East could cascade into a global unraveling of American dominance. At the same time, domestic pressures complicate Washington's response. The American public is wary of endless wars and foreign entanglements. Economic struggles at home, political polarization, and the lingering scars of Afghanistan and Iraq have created deep skepticism about new military commitments. If Russia believes that the U.S. lacks both the will and the unity to escalate another conflict, then it has calculated correctly that Washington's dominance is more fragile than it appears. This vulnerability at home adds another layer to the crisis. Even if military options exist, political will may not. The symbolic impact of this confrontation is equally important. Russia has framed its involvement not merely as military action, but as defiance against an unjust Western-led order. By targeting Israel, a nation often described as America's closest ally in the region, Moscow delivers a message not just to Washington, but to every country that has ever felt constrained by U.S. influence. The old hierarchy can be broken. This symbolism matters because it resonates with nations that have long sought alternatives to American leadership. It positions Russia not just as a military challenger, but as a political alternative, an architect of a new balance of power where the U.S. is no longer the sole arbiter. And so the world watches as Washington faces a moment of truth. The United States has thrived on being seen as indispensable, the one power that could not be challenged without severe repercussions. Russia is daring to dismantle that image. The challenge is not only on the battlefield, but in the realm of perception, where credibility is as valuable as firepower. If the U.S. cannot defend Israel decisively, its entire claim to global leadership comes into question. The real battle is not only in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem, but in the minds of nations across the globe who are recalculating where to place their trust, their resources, and their alliances. This is why Russia's challenge to U.S. dominance is so profound. It is not about one country versus another. It is about whether the United States can still command respect, fear, and loyalty in an increasingly multipolar world. By stepping into Israel's battlefield, Russia is doing far more than waging war. It is striking at the heart of American power itself. The economic consequences of Russia's direct confrontation with Israel are not confined to the battlefield. They reach deep into the arteries of global commerce, finance, and resource distribution. When a conflict of this scale erupts in the Middle East, the world feels the tremors not only in diplomatic circles, but in every corner of the marketplace. The attack is not just military. It is economic warfare by extension. Every missile launched, every declaration of hostility reverberates in oil markets, currency exchanges, and investment flows. This is where the conflict becomes universal. Even those with no connection to the Middle East will soon feel its effects at gas stations, supermarkets, and in their national economies. Russia knows this, and in many ways, the disruption itself is part of its strategy. The most immediate and obvious impact comes from energy markets. The Middle East is the lifeblood of global oil production, and Israel's conflict with Russia amplifies the sense of instability across the region. Markets do not wait for clarity, they respond to fear. As Russian aggression escalates, oil prices spike, creating a chain reaction that burdens households and industries worldwide. Transportation costs rise, food production becomes more expensive, and inflation worsens. This is the first hook. Ordinary people in faraway nations who may feel disconnected from geopolitics will suddenly find themselves paying the price for a war they did not start. Russia understands that such inflation weakens governments, stirs unrest, and fractures public confidence, especially in Western democracies already stretched by economic volatility. Beyond energy, the financial sector itself is shaken. Investors thrive on stability and predictability, but this conflict offers neither. Global markets operate on confidence, and confidence erodes when major powers openly threaten each other. Capital begins to flee risky regions, currencies fluctuate wildly, and safe haven assets like gold surge. Israel, long seen as a hub of technological innovation and investment in the Middle East, risks losing that reputation if it becomes synonymous with vulnerability. Companies and financiers may redirect their attention to safer markets, leaving Israel's economy weakened at a time when it needs strength the most. The perception of fragility in itself can trigger real economic decline. Here is another hook. Russia's timing is not accidental. By escalating against Israel while the global economy is still fragile from pandemic recovery and ongoing conflicts in Ukraine, Moscow is magnifying the shock waves. Western economies are already struggling with inflation, energy crisis, and political divisions. A new wave of instability threatens to break public patience with governments that appear incapable of shielding their populations from external shocks. This is a form of indirect pressure. Russia knows it cannot outspend the West militarily, but it can erode Western unity by fueling economic pain that fractures societies from within. Trade routes are also in jeopardy. The Middle East sits at a crossroads of global commerce, with critical shipping lanes like the Suez Canal carrying goods between Europe, Asia, and Africa. Any perception that conflict might spill into these routes threatens global supply chains already under strain. Imagine the ripple effect. Shipping insurance costs surge, delivery times lengthen, and the prices of everyday goods climb even higher. The battlefield may be in Israel, but the consequences are global, reshaping how goods flow from factories to consumers around the world. It is also important to consider the geopolitical weaponization of resources. Russia is already a major energy supplier, and its actions in Israel allow it to exert even greater leverage over oil and gas markets. By stirring instability in the Middle East, Moscow gains influence over pricing power, indirectly forcing Western nations to pay more for energy while Russia itself profits from the volatility. This creates a paradox. The very powers seeking to isolate Russia through sanctions may find themselves funding its ambitions simply by paying higher prices for oil, gas, and related commodities. Another layer to this economic unraveling lies in the psychological realm. Wars are not just fought with weapons, they are fought with fear. When consumers believe that prices will continue to rise, they adjust their behavior, hoarding goods, cutting spending, or demanding higher wages. This creates self-fulfilling cycles of inflation that governments struggle to contain. Russia's aggression against Israel, therefore, does more than disrupt supply. It destabilizes expectations, and expectations are often the most powerful driver of economic behavior. The most profound hook, however, is how this conflict accelerates the decline of trust in the Western-led economic system. If Israel, backed by decades of U.S. investment and protection, can be so destabilized, what does it say about the credibility of global markets tied to U.S. guarantees? Emerging economies in Africa, Asia, and Latin America may begin shifting their alignments toward alternative systems led by Russia and China. This shift is not immediate, but every crisis chips away at the dominance of Western financial institutions. What we are witnessing is not simply economic turbulence, it is the slow erosion of the very order that has governed international markets since World War II. Russia's confrontation with Israel, therefore, is not only a military strike, but an economic earthquake. The true battleground extends far beyond Tel Aviv or Gaza. It runs through oil fields, shipping lanes, trading floors, and consumer wallets. Every shockwave serves Russia's larger aim to destabilize its adversaries, not just with firepower, but with financial pressure. And as history has shown time and again, wars are won not only on the battlefield, but in the silent calculations of economies under strain. Russia's decision to openly declare its intention of destroying Israel without mercy is not just a military escalation, it is a deliberate symbolic rejection of the Western-led order that has dominated global politics for decades. For years, the United States and its allies have presented themselves as the architects and guardians of international law, democracy, and stability. Israel, backed consistently by Washington and often shielded diplomatically by Europe, has been one of the clearest representations of this order in the Middle East. By confronting Israel directly, Russia is striking at the symbol rather than just the state. It is sending a message not only to Washington, but to every country that has lived under the shadow of Western influence. The rules written by the West no longer apply. The symbolic weight of this moment cannot be overstated. Israel has long represented the West's foothold in a volatile region, a fortress propped up by American aid, technology, and political cover. It was meant to show that Western support could guarantee survival and dominance in even the most hostile environment. Russia's attack challenges that idea head on, exposing the fragility of a system that for decades has claimed inevitability. Here is the first hook. If Israel, the crown jewel of Western-backed security projects, can be directly undermined, then what other pillars of Western influence might crumble next? What Russia is really rejecting is the very legitimacy of the Western claim to moral and political authority. For years, the West has framed its interventions and alliances as the defense of international law and human rights, while critics have accused it of hypocrisy, pointing to selective enforcement and double standards. Russia's confrontation with Israel plays directly into this criticism. By striking Israel, a state often accused of heavy-handed policies against its neighbors, yet consistently shielded from accountability, Russia positions itself as the force willing to act where the West only speaks. Whether one agrees with this framing or not, the perception alone reshapes the geopolitical narrative. It makes Russia appear not just as an aggressor, but as a challenger to Western hypocrisy. This symbolic rejection extends beyond Israel. It resonates across nations in the global South, where resentment toward Western dominance has been simmering for years. Countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America have often felt the weight of Western economic systems, political pressure, and military influence. For them, Russia's bold move demonstrates that defiance is possible, that the so-called unshakable order can, in fact, be contested. This is another hook. Russia is not simply fighting Israel. It is appealing to the silent frustrations of dozens of nations who have long sought an alternative to Western dictates. The rejection also carries a powerful psychological dimension. For decades, the West has presented its order as natural, unchangeable, and permanent. Institutions like NATO, the IMF, and the UN Security Council were meant to reflect and enforce this stability. Yet, Russia's defiance demonstrates that permanence is an illusion. By disregarding the rules of Western diplomacy and striking directly at its ally, Moscow is creating a new perception that the old order can be bypassed, even dismantled. In politics, perception often becomes reality. If nations begin to believe that the West no longer has the authority to enforce its rules, then those rules cease to matter, regardless of what Washington or Brussels declare. Economically and politically, the symbolism extends further. Israel has often been portrayed as an innovation hub, a partner in Western-led development, and a democratic outpost in the Middle East. By destabilizing Israel, Russia undermines this narrative too. It demonstrates that Western-backed projects of influence are not indestructible and that alternative alignments, whether with Russia, China, or emerging coalitions of the global South, may offer different paths to survival and prosperity. This symbolism is not lost on leaders who have quietly questioned their dependence on Western institutions. They are watching closely, recalculating where to place their trust in the years ahead. Perhaps the deepest hook of all lies in how Russia frames its defiance as justice. To many, rightly or wrongly, Israel represents decades of Western double standards in foreign policy. By targeting Israel, Russia presents itself as dismantling not only a military rival but a symbol of Western hypocrisy. This gives Russia's actions a dual edge. They are not only tactical but ideological, offering a rallying cry for those who see themselves as victims of Western arrogance. This symbolism could prove as powerful as any missile, reshaping alliances and inspiring movements worldwide. What makes this symbolic rejection so dangerous is that it challenges the foundation of Western power in a way that cannot be undone through a single military response. If the United States retaliates militarily, it risks confirming Russia's narrative of an imperial West. If it fails to act, it confirms the perception of weakness. Either way, the symbolic blow has already been dealt. Israel's vulnerability becomes the emblem of Western decline, and Russia becomes the face of a world no longer willing to play by American rules. This rejection is not just about geopolitics. It is about rewriting the story of power itself. The risk of global confrontation is no longer a distant theory. It is now a palpable possibility emerging from Russia's decision to openly challenge Israel. This is not a localized conflict confined to the borders of the Middle East. Instead, it is the kind of escalation that forces the entire international system into motion, dragging powers into alignment, confrontation, or retreat. When Russia targets Israel, it does not only provoke one state, it provokes the United States, NATO, Europe, and potentially every major actor with interests in the stability of the region. The hook here is clear. What begins as a direct strike on Israel could unravel into the opening act of a much larger, more devastating war with global reach. At the heart of this risk lies the U.S. response. Washington has built its identity as the guarantor of Israel's security, a role it has reinforced with billions in military aid, intelligence cooperation, and political protection. If Russia succeeds in striking Israel without a decisive American reaction, it sends a devastating signal U.S. commitments can be broken, and U.S. deterrence no longer carries weight. That in turn would encourage adversaries across the globe to test Washington's resolve. Yet if the U.S. decides to intervene militarily, it faces the nightmare scenario of direct confrontation with Russia, a nuclear power with the capacity to escalate beyond conventional war. This is the razor's edge of global politics. Every move carries catastrophic risks. Europe, too, is drawn into this dangerous equation. Already burdened by the war in Ukraine, European nations are facing fatigue, economic strain, and political divisions. If the Middle East descends into chaos, Europe will not be able to remain on the sidelines. Refugee flows, energy crisis, and terror threats could quickly spill into European borders, forcing NATO to act in a region it has long tried to avoid. This creates a second hook. The very alliances designed to maintain peace may be the ones pulled into an uncontrollable escalation, expanding the battlefield beyond the Middle East into a wider confrontation between East and West. The danger is amplified by the involvement of other regional players. Iran, long an adversary of Israel, could view Russia's aggression as a green light to escalate its own activities. Hezbollah, already embedded in Lebanon, may seize the moment to intensify its campaigns, creating a multi-front conflict that stretches Israel's defenses to the breaking point. Meanwhile, Gulf states like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, once cautiously aligned with Washington, may be forced to reconsider their allegiances if U.S. protection looks unreliable. This instability risks pulling the entire Middle East into a vortex of conflict, with each nation recalculating its interests in real time. Another dimension of this risk is how rival powers outside the region perceive the crisis. China, for example, has been closely observing how the West manages its commitments. If Washington appears weakened or overstretched by simultaneous crises in Ukraine, Israel, and potentially the South China Sea, Beijing may see this as an opportune moment to accelerate its ambitions toward Taiwan. North Korea, too, could exploit the distraction to intensify provocations on the Korean Peninsula. This cascading effect is the true danger, a single conflict igniting multiple others, overwhelming the capacity of the current international order to respond. Economics, once again, plays into the calculus of confrontation. As conflicts spread, markets spiral, and resources become scarce, nations are driven into desperate decisions. Sanctions, blockades, and trade disruptions could push fragile economies to collapse, further fueling instability. Russia may actually count on this chaos, understanding that a fractured global economy weakens Western unity while strengthening alternative blocs led by Moscow and Beijing. In such an environment, the competition for resources and influence could escalate into direct clashes, further widening the scope of war. Perhaps the most profound hook in this scenario lies in the collapse of communication and trust between major powers. During the Cold War, even at moments of extreme tension, back-channel negotiations and mutual recognition of red lines prevented total catastrophe. Today, that trust has eroded. Moscow and Washington no longer view each other as rational adversaries bound by common rules. The absence of diplomacy makes escalation more likely, as each side interprets the other's moves with suspicion and assumes the worst. In such a climate, a single miscalculation, a missile strike that goes too far, a cyber attack that cripples critical infrastructure, a naval confrontation that spirals out of control could trigger a chain reaction no one can stop. The world is thus staring at a future shaped by uncertainty, instability, and the terrifying prospect of global confrontation. Russia's aggression against Israel is not simply about territorial disputes or regional rivalries. It is a stress test for the entire global system, pushing nations into choices they are unprepared to make. Will the U.S. risk escalation to maintain its dominance? Will Europe find the strength to stand unified under pressure? Will other powers seize the moment to expand their influence? These are the questions that now define the risk we face. The simple but chilling truth is this: we are no longer in an era where wars remain contained. Each spark ignites a greater fire, and Russia's strike against Israel could be the match that sets the entire global order ablaze. In closing, I remind you, moments like this do not come often. They define generations. They leave scars on nations. They decide whether empires rise or collapse. Russia's official step into the destruction of Israel will not just shape tomorrow's headlines, it will shape the destiny of our children and grandchildren. The world is watching, history is unfolding, and whether we like it or not, we are all part of this story. In closing, I remind you, moments like this do not come often. They define generations. They leave scars on nations. They decide whether empires rise or collapse. Russia's official step into the destruction of Israel will not just shape tomorrow's headlines, it will shape the destiny of our children and grandchildren. The world is watching, history is unfolding, and whether we like it or not, we